and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, How to Keep Your Roof in the Storms, 10th of September 2014. It is patently obvious from television and print media coverage that damage incurred from Perth storms in recent days is the result of construction methods that fall well below the standards of those in the northwest cyclone zone. At the same time, blame is directed at changing climatic conditions, not poor construction. Instead of accepting, as I did, that more robust construction was required and that established buildings needed simple upgrading, the residents of metropolitan Perth, after at least 3 years of tornado-like events, still do nothing to have their roof structures inspected. Wilson Tucky, Ascot. Uncharacteristically, I've snipped out a whole part of the letter where the writer goes on to explain what he thinks are the required upgrades to roofing structures, etc., which I'm completely uninterested in. Firstly, I want to point out that Wilson Tucky of Ascot is a ex-politician, retired, also known as Iron Bar because he was convicted of he owned a pub and he was convicted of beating a Aboriginal patron with an iron bar in his earlier career. This is the kind of guy we're dealing with. And the thing I like about this letter is he starts off, he simultaneously acknowledges that Perth's buildings are the reason that they're being damaged in these fairly recent tornado-like events is because they're not up to the construction standards of the northwest cyclone zone. And he somehow fails to recognise that there's probably a good reason that most Perth buildings are not built to the standards of the northwest cyclone zone, and that's because we're not in the northwest cyclone zone. In fact, we are literally thousands of kilometres away from it. So the fact that it's now becoming apparent that perhaps we should be building to the kinds of conditions that they once were reserved for thousands of kilometres away, would you think would be a hint that we're experiencing some kind of climate change. But no. He doesn't want to go there because, like all right-wing people, and ex-politicians in particular, he doesn't want to acknowledge that any kind of climate change is happening. On the face of it, the fact that we are having, seemingly, and I'm not sure that we are, but his letter seems to be suggesting that he's at least accepted that we are having more of these tornado-type things happening in Perth, that this was an unusual thing up until somewhat recently. He seems to be accepting, on the face of it, what seems like reasonable evidence that the climate is changing, or at least our local climate is changing. That doesn't say that it's, caused by humans or that it's anything to do with global warming or any of the rest of it, but it does seem to be fairly convincing evidence. The fact that he was, pushed to write a letter, that this is, made him want to write a letter in, I can't quite understand how he hasn't, quite clicked that having to build our houses to the standards of the northwest cyclone zone isn't a good indicator that the climate is changing here. I don't know what would. Next up, sharks saved, but look at crime rate, 13th of September 2014. To those people who protested to Colin Barnett about sharks being cruelly caught, who were all out there with their banners and abusing the people who are only doing their job, if only you would protest in the same way to the Premier when we hear that people are being bashed and robbed, some victims being in wheelchairs. Where are all of you when we see the crime rate climbing and we hear nothing from politicians and see the justice system giving out slaps on the wrists? If with your protests you have achieved what you wanted by stopping sharks from being killed, maybe you could protest in the same way about crime. Iris Baker, Thornley. Now, I'll have more to say about the shark cull because I've got another letter about that coming up. But this one I liked because it seemed to be suggesting that somehow the government's decision on the shark cull is akin to the government's policies in other areas. So for those who aren't familiar with West Australian local politics, last summer there was a move to cull sharks using drum lines set off beaches in the southwest. Only the southwest because that's where everybody lives. I don't really care about anybody else. This was prompted by 5 people being killed in shark attacks in the last 3 years, which is a rate of just under 2 a year, which is a very small number given the amount of utilisation our beaches have, and is in line with all of statistical trends that show that basically this is not something to be worried about. recently, the Environmental Protection Agency have handed down their decision that the science behind the cull is uncertain. We're not sure about what the effects would be on these shark species, many of which are protected because they are highly endangered, and therefore the shark cull isn't allowed to go ahead. Cue a lot of people being upset. When the shark cull was first announced, there was a whole pile of protests, and there was actually some quite strident protesting of the kind that you might think of Greenpeace doing. There was vandalising of the Premier's electorate office. There was a lot of abuse thrown at, mainly just verbal abuse, but thrown at the companies involved in administering the shark cull, primarily as a way of pressuring them to not get involved with it, and so to de facto prevent the government from enforcing it. None of this was successful. Now, to compare the shark cull with the government's policy on crime is problematic, because the shark cull was a decision that was made basically by the Premier as a simple thought bubble policy that he came up with, and most people suspect as some kind of purely political move to garner some kind of popular support and to boost his popularity. It was quite effective in doing that, because there's a significant chunk of the populace who like to see strong, decisive leaders taking strong, decisive action. And in fact, the backlash by the sort of the greeny, hippie people who protested actually, in some ways, boosted his support amongst his core constituents. Now, this was a decision taken by a small chunk of the government, the Premier, without any kind of consultation with the community, no widespread consultation with Cabinet or anything like that. And so it was seen as being, and it was a policy of action by the government to do something. And so the protests were trying to reverse that decision and to get the government to not take an action. Now, crime, on the other hand, is not something that the government does. The government is responsible for preventing crime as much as possible. And so it's unclear exactly what you would be expecting people to protest here. They can't simply protest out the government side, the government's action, saying, you know, government, stop doing crime, because the government isn't doing crime. Now, you're alluding to the idea that the alleged crime rate increases are related somehow to the justice system's sentencing. Now, firstly, the justice system, or at least the judiciary, is technically independent of our legislature. And so protesting to the government would only have a limited effect on the sentencing done by the judiciary. So it's wrong on that thing. Secondly, it's been well established that, you know, our crime rate is not going to get any lower by increasing penalties. Increasing sentences has diminishing returns in terms of its reduction in crime rates, and we are basically at the point where, you know, no matter what the sentence is, all of our sentences are sufficiently high to have served whatever effect we are expecting to affect. From this point on, simply increasing penalties is unlikely to significantly affect any of the crime rates or for any of the major crimes. And so therefore, even though you may perceive the justice system as giving slaps on the wrist, that's not actually encouraging crime. So actually, the factors driving crime are other things that need addressing. Now, the other thing about this is that you have not demonstrated, nor can you demonstrate, that crime rates have been increasing. If anything, they have been going down. Numbers of actual crimes have decreased slightly across some categories and have remained static across other categories, while our population has been increasing a lot. And therefore, crime rates across the Western world, Australia in particular, and Western Australia and Perth in particular, have been decreasing for the last 40 years. And certainly for the last 10 years, there's been a steady decrease in crime, particularly violent crime. So when you're talking about people being bashed and robbed and victims in wheelchairs, those kind of crimes have been going down steadily for the last 30 to 40 years across all government types. Now, when you say that where are these people protesting a government's approach to crime? Well, actually, most of the people who would have been at protests about the shark cull, a lot of those people would have been at protests to the cuts in education and cuts in welfare and cuts in social security funding, all of which have some impact on the crime rate. And one of the reasons why many of us on the left, at least, support things like education and welfare is because we know that these have a demonstrable link to crime rates. And so we are, those people who go to these, have been going to these rallies and these protests about the shark cull, are actually protesting the government on policies related to crime rates. So there you have it, I respect. You might not agree with that, but these people are not necessarily being hypocritical. That poor doctor, 13th of September 2014. A lady doctor driving alone on a road near Roebourne in April 2002, whose car was narrowly missed by an out-of-control Land Rover, has been unfairly treated by the State Administrative Tribunal for failing to stop and offer assistance after the Land Rover crashed. Doctors uneasy about aid rule, 11th of the 9th. For all she knew in the darkness, an occupant might have been well enough to get out of the vehicle, blame her for the crash, and then try to harm her. Even if she had been trained in unarmed combat, there is no guarantee she would have emerged unscathed. The authorities ought to be ashamed of themselves. John C. Massam, Greenwood. Okay, so backstory. Yes, April 2002, a doctor, female doctor, was driving alone near Roebourne, which is in the north of the state, quite relatively sort of away from the major metropolitan centre. Was narrowly missed by an out-of-control car, which then crashed. The doctor took the decision that instead of stopping, that she would continue on, and when she reached the next police station, which, so anybody who's unfamiliar with West Australia, I think this was at least 20 minutes or half an hour drive to the next police station, because we're talking areas that are, well, she can't have been that remote, let's put it that way. So 20 to 30 minutes later, she arrived at the police station. She then reported the crash to the police, and then they attended with ambulance, I believe, and I think somebody died. Now, she was taken in front of the medical board or equivalent, because doctors have a medical, a professional obligation to stop when there's a crash. And she was disciplined over it. Now, that then went to, I think this was appealed, etc., and it's just recently been through the State Administrative Tribunal, which is essentially the last court of appeal for these kind of non-criminal matters like this, non-governmental matters. So this is between her and the medical board, which is an independent entity from the government. And so it's been in front of the State Administrative Tribunal, and they've decided that actually the medical board's decision to whatever the discipline that she received was okay. And of course there's been some upset over this, because it's claimed that she shouldn't have stopped because she was reasonable to be afraid of the occupants of the vehicle that had crashed. That is, that she had a fear for her safety, and that's what prevented her from stopping, and that this fear was reasonable. Now, the main point I want to make here is, so before you say, what about, why didn't she make a call on her mobile phone? I'm not sure if she had one or not. 2002 is 12 years ago, but even now there's much of this state that has no mobile phone access. If you're outside of the town, in the far north, you're unlikely to have any kind of mobile phone access. And so that was reasonable. The point I want to make is that Roebourne is in the far north and has a relatively large Aboriginal population, certainly compared to the southwest. And I suspect, and this is only a suspicion, and maybe I'm seeing racism where there isn't any, but I suspect that part of her fear of stopping for the crash was that the suspicion was that they may well have been Aboriginal occupants, and that her fear for her own safety was predicated on it potentially being Aboriginal occupants who are assumed to be more violent and more dangerous. And that I suspect there's an undercurrent of this in other people's objection to this as well. That had this occurred in Perth metropolitan area, that she would have been much more likely to have stopped, and other people would have been much more critical of her had she not done it. But the fact that this happened near Roebourne, which has this connotation of being full of drunk, violent Aboriginal people, that's the perception people have, that therefore she was okay to have not even stopped. I mean, she could have even stayed in her car if she was terrified. She could have stopped, she could have reversed up, she could have put the headlights on to at least scope out the situation. The fact that she did none of these things. And the other thing is that I suspect that the medical board took all of this into account, that they examined her behaviour in detail in the full context of what the situation was and deemed it to not be appropriate for a doctor. No, nobody should have to stop if there is an actual danger to them. But I don't think you get to assume there's a danger simply based on the fact that you happen to be in Roebourne that has Aboriginal people there. I suspect that there's a fair bit of racism involved there. I don't feel safe, 13th of September 2014. The shark cull is off as Premier Barnett meets the ruling by the Environmental Protection Authority. I am confident this move will be for the betterment of the shark species. I wish I had the same acknowledgement about my feelings of safety when I go for my next swim in the ocean. Ron Elliott, Palmyra. Now, the thing is, your feelings of safety are largely unrelated to your actual safety, and so I feel fairly comfortable in dismissing them. I mean, I think the government should do a job at trying to reassure swimmers, but the way to reassure them isn't by culling sharks. That's a waste of time and money that doesn't do much to actually improve safety. We have shark culling in other states, and I'm unaware of any decent research that shows that it actually reduces the rate of shark deaths. I'm certainly unaware of any research that would suggest that it would be good here, where our number of shark attack victims is relatively low. The other thing is, if the government was truly interested in saving the lives or making safer swimmers, then they could have spent the money on the shark cull on a number of other things that would have had a much better impact. If you're looking for bang for buck, they could have done things like improving road safety on the way to and from the beach. More people are killed in car accidents driving to and from the beach than they are killed by sharks in the water. They could have done things like improve funding for lifeguards at the beach. This is primarily volunteer-driven, and there's much more that could be done in preventing drownings. Many more people drown at beaches than are taken by sharks. They could have put more money into researching sharks. If they genuinely thought there was a shark attack issue, then that money could be much better spent on researching the issue with sharks rather than just culling them. At the moment, our knowledge of sharks is pathetically low for us to base any kind of decisions on what to do. So, if the true concern was for your safety at the beach, there are many other things that the government could have been spending their money on. The fact that none of those things may not have made you feel safer is really just an artefact of your irrationality when it comes to evaluating risk. Off to war. Now name the enemy. 16th of September 2014. Australian forces are once again being deployed overseas, this time to support Iraqi and Kurdish Peshmerga forces. For the safety of our troops, it's time our leaders called a spade and identified the enemy. We're not fighting a war on terror or an evil death cult. What we are witnessing is a resurgence of Islam in its purest form, with devout Muslims attempting to re-establish a global caliphate or Islamic state. Debbie Robinson Dunn Craig. Now, this is one of those perennial issues that I take up every time one of these things come in, but the ISIS forces in the Middle East are not the purest form of Islam. They are not the only devout Muslims. This is like calling the Westboro Baptist Church the purest form of Christianity. Every Christian, every Muslim, in fact, I won't say all religious people because I'm not familiar with other religions, but certainly every Christian and every Muslim has to pick and choose those parts of their holy book that they want to go with. The Bible is full of condemning people to death by stoning, and it's full of love thy enemies and turn the other cheek. There is no way to reconcile these. There is no purest Muslim. They are all as bastardized as each other. Sure, some religious people take it further than others. Some religious people are more willing to act on their faith than others. But on the one side, to say we have I'll stick with Christianity for the moment, I'll get back to Islam. The Westboro Baptist Church, they are full of conviction that their version of it is correct, and they are full of the willingness to act on their beliefs. On the other hand, we have many, many Christian people in this country whose belief is that God is love and that Christianity is all about helping those people who are less fortunate and, none of this condemning, who also act on their beliefs. The whole asylum seeker, being compassionate to asylum seekers in this country, that whole movement is largely a Christian movement. I'm ashamed to say that secular people haven't taken that on board. It is the churches in this country who are spearheading that movement, who do the most to help the poor and defenceless asylum seekers who are locked in detention. And so to claim that one side or the other is the most pure form of Christianity is simply wrong. Neither of them are particularly pure because the Bible itself cannot be taken purely because it is full of contradictions. The same goes for the Quran. It is slightly more bloodthirsty than the Bible, only because it doesn't have quite as much New Testament to balance its Old Testament metaphorically. But it has plenty in there about not killing people and respecting other people's decisions and, allowing for the non-believer to live peacefully amongst you. And there's plenty of that in there that a lot of Muslims live by. There are a lot of devout Muslims, particularly in Southeast Asia, who are not driven to these genocidal type behaviours. And those people in ISIS who are committing these horrible acts of violence in the name of Islam, sure, they're basing that on their interpretation of the text, but it is no less of an interpretation than any other interpretation. And so while I condemn their actions utterly, you are falling into their own rhetoric. ISIS will paint themselves, just like the Western Baptists do, that they are the true representatives of their faith. But that's just them saying it. And so we should reject that at every turn. There are just as Quranically accurate takes on the faith that don't involve killing the infidel. They happen to ignore those bits of the Quran while they accept the other bits. ISIS, on the other hand, ignore the bits about peace and love and take up the bits about killing and stoning. It's no more hypocritical than every other religious person that I'm aware of. And so let's not fall into the trap of somehow thinking that the ISIS people are the true Muslims and that everybody else are not true Muslims, because every Muslim picks and chooses just like every Christian does. Anyway, that's it for this week. Hope you've enjoyed it. I've had a great time. I feel much better for having got that off my chest. And I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.